We will be talking about practical aspects of SOC operation. And we are going to hear from Anton Yudakov with Rostelecom Solar. Hello. I'd like to share my screen, please.
Да, я постарался вывести все
I have tried to make sure that all the important functions are on the screen, including the chat. My name is Anton Yudakov. I'm with Solar SOC, which is actually the largest SOC in Russia and the CIS countries. And I would love to use the opportunity today to share our practice and our knowledge about counteracting cyber attacks without getting swamped with incidents. Let me start by telling you about the cyber landscape, about the kind of attacks we are thwarting and how we're doing that. By doing this, I will be able to talk about the way we link specific attacks and attackers to the requirements for SOCs. But first, let's consider the current cyber landscape. Over the first half of 2020, we have seen significant increase in the number of external attacks, roughly 40% increase. Also, in certain areas, we are seeing much higher growth. I guess this is primarily due to what has made this year so special. But actually, if you look at the overall trends, some of them dating back to 2019, you will see significant increase in the caliber of the perps. The adversaries have learned how to bypass these standard security tools and some standard SOC capabilities. We are seeing growing, complexity and sophistication of the attacks. Also, we see that many attacks are getting more distributed, and many attackers are trying to ensure persistence in the infrastructure. That may sound like a set of conflicting messages, which in fact it isn't. When analyzed closely, we will see that actually adversaries are developing different tools for, attacking infrastructures depending on their objectives. So let's start with malware. The mechanisms for the malware's distribution and obfuscation are getting more and more sophisticated compared, say, to 2019 or previous years. Vulnerabilities are becoming easier to exploit. They are being sort of released as part of exploits, and very often many of them are being used as part of large attack campaigns, say within several weeks after they become known, but actually at the same time some pretty old vulns are also being used. And if we're talking about some sophisticated infrastructure, say critical infrastructure, what we see quite often is that attackers are trying to obfuscate and hide their activities as much as they can. They are trying, for example, to use as many legit utilities as they can. And they are hiding all the external channels they use to enter the system. So they try to camouflage all their activities as alleged activities on the client infrastructure. Actually, our analysis has shown that the share of such attacks has grown considerably over the previous, say, 18 months. Now, as regards the entry points, we see the well-known perimeter attacks, such as RDP, brute forcing, say Windows hosts supporting remote connection, and if they have simple passwords, they are not going to last more than 30 minutes before they get compromised, while previously many of them would last for something like 5 hours. We also see a growing number of web applications which take very little time to be hacked. At the same time, another important vector of attack is phishing campaigns, where adversaries are getting, well, adapted to what's topmost in our agenda. Now, I am quoting some CDC health reports here, which doesn't mean all of them are using COVID as, the main subject, but they are very much abreast of the recent developments because they want to maximize the conversion ratio. Remote users are getting attacked. Obviously, their number has mushroomed this year. Because obviously so many users had to use their own personal devices as opposed to better protected corporate devices. So quite naturally, this has become a very popular vector of attack. What we're also seeing, and this could actually be a result of the previous item, that is attacks targeting remote users, but we are seeing an increase in the number of attacks directed against supply chains. That is, rather than trying to hack impenetrable fortresses, perpetrators try to hack their partners on the supply chain. Now, let's go back to my earlier statement about growing diversity in the methods used by adversaries. The old distinction we had, where we had base attacks, hackers, and APTs, what we have now is actually a slightly different paradigm. I think we should employ a different classification. I would rather talk about these 5 categories of adversaries. In the first 2 levels, we see adversaries with pretty low qualifications. For example, some of them will try hacking like thousands of similar websites around the world. They will be, say, brute forcing accounts and credentials, not because they want to go inside the infrastructure, but because they simply want to, say, resell those credentials data for further attacks, for example. And DDoS attacks will fall in the same category. And these perps will be using a pretty broad range of automated or ready-made tool sets, which are easy to find on the net. Now, an average perpetrator, cybercriminal, or organized cybercrime groups, they will be using primarily customized tools. Quite often, they will employ pretty sophisticated social engineering, and monetization of their attacks is their utmost objective. It could be through encryption or mining or what have you. The most advanced and obviously the most persistent adversaries would include cyber mercenaries or cyber military groups. Obviously, will have different targets. Very often they will be using proprietary malware, something that can be termed proper, real cyber arms. And as regards their objectives include getting hold on the infrastructure and staying hidden in it for a long time, primarily for the purposes of cyber espionage, which can actually be camouflaged, if need be, as some other nefarious purpose. Now, as regards the threat that these different groups pose, and the measures that companies need to implement in order to thwart them, what we shall say is that the first 2 groups are the ones that, say, municipal authorities and SMEs will be primarily exposed to. And in order to stay protected, you have to first and foremost observe basic hygiene rules. That is, install your patches, employ, the basic monitoring and protection suites. Because even those should be sufficient to give you a decent level of protection. But as regards the average groups, these are usually the ones that we got used to calling APT attacks. And this could be a misnomer because they are getting more and more widespread. We're seeing them, attacking whole industries or countries. And this kind of caliber of attackers will primarily go after large corporations. And large corporations tend to be pretty sophisticated, pretty mature in terms of their information security tools. And actually, in order to protect themselves, they will need to employ attack monitoring tools or threat monitoring tools. And besides the usual practices here, what you will need will also include, say, proactive adaptation of your security policies and rules, and also higher class monitoring designed to help you identify anomalies and deviations in the way that your main nodes are being used. I believe that financial services institutions are mostly facing this kind of threats. And as regards to the last two layers, the best qualified, the most dangerous cyber criminal groups, groups 4 and 5, usually have the objective of getting hold of the infrastructure, cyber espionage, long persistence, and so on. And they will be mostly attacking large corporations, whatever the industry, as long as they have critical information infrastructure. And naturally, they will also be attacking key governmental institutions. In order to be able to withstand those attacks, you will need a much broader set of sophisticated cybersecurity and cyber defense tools for IR as well. I think it will make a lot of sense for organizations falling in this category to use more than just a set of advanced tools, but also to develop multi-vendor, several echelons, a defense system consisting of several tiers. Okay, if we are dealing with threats of level 4 and 5 who are really good at what they do, so how can we thwart their attacks? Particularly if you have convoluted infrastructure. And I was about to crack this joke and say without spending $1 billion, but it's not that much of a joke, really. Because very often, information security and IT systems, they're not static at all, and they keep changing, and the pace of change is growing. Actually, this is what became crystal clear this year, when there was a business need for most corporations to change the way they operate very quickly. And let me call a spade a spade. Some companies proved to be agile enough, but most companies suffered in their transition to remote work. So what we believe is an adequate response to these threats, and this is what we do in real life, involves separation of infrastructure into several levels, where you actually use different approaches, different philosophies, if you like, dealing with different levels.
любого
For instance,
критичного бизнеса можно выделить
for any critical business, it makes sense to identify critical business processes and critical infrastructural assets, something we are showing as critical core here.
к ее защите, да, защите
And it is protection of this cluster of infrastructure and its monitoring that we need to emphasize and we need to be particularly strict about.
при соответствующей архитектурной готовности, да, применение расширенного набора
Well,
среднего
if you've got the capabilities, it is obviously advised to employ broader audits and broader protection tools here
каких-то аномалий, отклонений.
to emphasize anomaly detection and analysis. I actually have all this listed in my slides. I hope the slides will be shared with all the participants later. But let me stress here that there are other segments as well, not just the critical core, something I call critical general, for example. Critical general covers the extent of infrastructure which is not the same as critical core, but still it contains a lot of important information, and if critical general services or systems are compromised, it will give the adversaries a lot of privileges and lots of munches.
Набора куска инфраструктуры, да,
So,
для этого сегмента.
What applies to this segment is in fact a similar set of tools for defense and monitoring, but it can be kind of scaled down. It can be smartly adapted to the actual needs. For example, I'm guessing that you won't really need behavioral analysis throughout critical general analysis, although it's a good idea actually to have behavioral analysis for the administrators in charge of the workplaces or workstations, so that you have the functionality in place to analyze deviations. As regards the other infrastructure, called general here, and I'm guessing it will constitute the bulk of your overall infrastructure, also needs to be monitored and defended. However, the SLAs here can be significantly lower, and this should give you a very good value for your, if not money, then at least your effort.
И, по сути, извлекать такую максимальную выгоду. Мы, с одной стороны, распределяем усилия.
Well, because this way you will be able to emphasize your efforts on what really matters, rather than looking for a needle in a haystack. Some scenarios will not enable you to identify perpetrators in the general infrastructure, and this is a risk we accept. However, emphasizing our protection in the other elements, we increase our chances of identifying serious incidents before they actually happen. So, critical core, obviously, will be the last tier of our defense, and we hope that attacks will be detected and thwarted earlier than that. Now, you may get the impression that what I'm telling you sounds like a neat structure. But obviously, a real operation of a SOC is not that neat or smooth. Quite often, SOCs have to overcome lots of unnecessary challenges. Very often, protection tools or proper business processes simply cannot be deployed. Sometimes, you cannot conduct the very necessary changes as fast as you would like to. Which means that what we do is not just technical, it also has a significant communications component.
Становится сильно актуальным, да, то, что темп изменений как вызов.
And the pace of change itself is a challenge. We have to react fast, but in real life it is often impossible. Quite often, changes simply cannot be conducted at the right time. However, there is an activity which we are trying to promote and run in different ways in order to help us stay abreast of the development. I am talking here about the testing process. Well, I've listed some requirements for infrastructure segments in the previous slide. I hope you can revisit the slides later. So I'm saying here that we are testing and we are being tested roughly about 1 week per month. Well, because this is how we can check if we can withstand the real cyber attacks happening in the wild. This includes our internal processes for testing. This is what we do, when we are preparing and running scenarios, attack scenarios, but we're also doing red teaming and pen testing using our own teams and external teams as well. In fact, we can also test infrastructure resilience, taking into account the expected level of sophistication of the potential adversary. We believe that these tests are incredibly useful because they provide us not just with technical feedback, not just with a general understanding of the level of protection, but they also help us identify the root cause issues, including the ones that are, well, the crux of our discussions, arguments, and conflicts with our operational clients. And this is true both for internal SOCs and SOCs as a service. So these tests give us enough arguments to prove our point and expedite change. But obviously, change still must be conducted in a step-by-step manner. However, this approach helps us do it faster and save our time. So, in the same platform, I actually talked about metrics of efficiency of SOCs. So let me briefly repeat myself here. First, SOCs must meet the challenges of the business, which means that, they must target primarily the kind of attacks that are most probable for a given operation. Secondly, SOCs, must develop the InfoSec architecture together with the other parties in the company. So it may be a challenging journey, but in most cases, we are able to cover this journey together with the client, and we will explore the breadth and depth of the infrastructure, including the critical core and critical general segment. And also, we usually help the client take all the necessary steps towards changing his infrastructure. Sometimes it involves changes in the infrastructure, sometimes deployment of new information systems, sometimes major updates to an existing system. So it's a working engagement, so to speak. Let me summarize my speech now. My key statements here are as follows. Well, first, the level of sophistication of perps has gone up considerably. This is true pretty much across the board, and I believe that SOCs must evolve quickly as well in order to stay relevant. In order to thwart top-level attacks, obviously you will need highly advanced SOCs and protection tools. At the same time, common sense is still useful, and please remember that communication is uber important, because you don't always need full view coverage. And in fact, full view should not be a constraint. The Pareto rule can be applied here as well. Quite often, the perimeter is so blurred and the pace of change is so high that it will be impossible to stop the attack at the first step. And it may be perfectly okay and much more doable to identify attacks and stop them at a later stage. I think it's incredibly important to stay in touch with the business, and regardless of which SOC, what kind of SOC we're talking about, is it in-house or third-party provided, in any case, it must be efficient and transparent. It should generate enough use cases for the business users to understand. So if you can develop a transparent infrastructure, something that would make sense to your business partners, this will be, a great advantage for your SOC. I've skimmed through this presentation. I would certainly love to talk more about it. Actually, I am planning to do it several weeks later at a different event, which will also be held online. It will be called SOC Forum, and there my colleagues and myself are going to be, more vocal, more verbose, talking about our practice and our learnings. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Anton, for your report. It's a very interesting but a very challenging time. That's why we have so many questions, particularly regarding transition to remote work. One of them we need you to answer. Do you think that the number of incidents has grown because of the growth in remote work? And has it resulted in extra time being spent by SOC employees investigating them? I understand the question. Thank you. Let me answer as follows. Obviously, the number of attacks and the number of incidents has grown. Actually, this is something I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, where I shared some stats. However, much will depend on the particular areas. For example, DDoS attacks have grown by leaps and bounds, by a number of times, so to speak, while SMEs, particularly middle-sized corporations who have not exposed any additional services on the perimeter, have seen very little growth. We're talking, single-digit percentage growth there. And the rate of this transition, the pace of this transition, was way too high for some corporations. They were simply not equipped, in order to perform it quickly enough. They were not able to scale their security standards in time, even if they had good security standards before, which means that there were new attack vectors available for the adversaries. And obviously, they didn't think twice about abusing those opportunities or using them. And as regards the speed of reaction, it's actually an interesting situation, because the peak times of activity for corporations have shifted now because of remote work. So what we're seeing now, both internally and in our third-party engagements, is that the amount of work has grown, and we had therefore to adapt our working hours and the number of classes of events that we had to react to has grown as well. It may be a coincidence, but that was the time when most of our clients were experiencing a lot of extra work activity now that people stopped commuting. I understand that, people were working extra hard at that time, and I believe that this is what helped a number of SOCs to maintain decent response times. Now, this is my personal opinion, but I believe we need to draw a distinction here between various types of incident responses. Take, for example, virtual infrastructure with virtual rules that will identify events which can be construed as potential incidents. They are not that important to many clients compared to, say, hacks through the perimeter and gaining foothold in the production infrastructure. So I believe that where it mattered, most SOCs were ready, and they did react in time. So I think they were able to maintain their SLAs. Thank you very much for your answer. I don't think we have other questions yet. Okay. If this is the case, then I would love to thank both the organizers of the event and, most importantly, those who have tuned in to listen to my report. If you have any questions regarding my presentation, you can submit them here, but I understand that my presentation is being recorded, and there you will find both my contact details and the announcement of the other events where I'm going to speak. It is certainly a far cry from live communication, but we'll have to live with it. Thank you very much, Anton, again. Thank you very much. Then have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.